8:30 the next morning, there was a smart tap on the door, and in answer to Miss Marple's "Come in," the door was opened, and an elderly woman entered, bearing a tray with a teapot, a cup and a milk jug, and a small plate of bread and butter.
"Early morning tea, ma'am. It's a nice day, it is. I see you've got your curtains drawn back already. You slept well, then?" "Very well indeed, thank you."
Miss Marple lay aside a small devotional book which she had been reading.
"Well, it's a lovely day, it is. They'll have it nice for going to Bonaventure Rocks. It's just as well you're not doing it, though. It's cruel hard on the legs, it is. I'm really very happy to be here. So kind of Miss Bradbury Scott and Mrs. Glynn to issue the invitation. Oh, well, it's nice for them, too. Cheers them up, have a bit of company in the house. There we are. Ah, it's a sad place nowadays, so it is."
She pulled the curtains at the window rather more fully, and pushed back a chair and deposited a can of hot water in the china basin.
"There's a bathroom on the next floor, but we think it's always better for someone elderly to have their hot water here, so you don't have to climb the stairs." "Oh, how very kind of you, I'm sure. You know the house well?" "Oh, yes, I was here as a girl. I was the housemaid. 3 servants they had then. A cook, housemaid, parlour-maid, kitchen-maid too at one time. Oh, that was in the old Colonel's time. Horses he kept too, and a groom. Oh, those are the days. Sad it is when things happen the way they do. He lost his wife young, the Colonel did, and his son was killed in the war, and his only daughter went away to live on the other side of the world. Married a New Zealander, she did. Died having a baby, and the baby died too. Oh, he was a sad man living alone here. He let the house go. It wasn't kept up as it should have been. When he died, he left the place to his niece, Miss Clotilde, and her 2 sisters. She and Miss Anthea came to live here, and, well, later, Miss Lavinia lost her husband, so she came to join them. Oh, dear. They never did much to the house either. Well, they couldn't afford it. And they let the garden go as well. It all seems a great pity. Yes, and such nice ladies as they all are. Miss Anthea's the scatty one, but Miss Clotilde went to university, and she's very brainy. She talks 3 languages. And Mrs. Glynn, well, she's a very nice lady indeed. I thought when she came to join them, things might get better, you know, but you never know what the future holds. I feel sometimes as though there's a doom on this house." "Really?" "Well, first one thing and then another. I mean, the dreadful plane accident. In Spain, that was. Everybody killed. Oh, they're nasty things, aeroplanes. I'd never go in one of them. Miss Clotilde's friends were both killed, husband and wife. The daughter was still at school, luckily. She escaped. Miss Clotilde brought her here to live, did everything for her. Took her abroad for trips to Italy and France, treated her like a daughter. And she was such a happy girl. Very sweet nature. You'd never dream such an awful thing would happen." "But an awful thing? What was it? Did it happen here?" "No, not here, thank God. Though in a way you might say it did, because, well, it was here she met him. He was in the neighbourhood. The ladies knew his father. His father was a very rich man, so he came here to visit. And that was the beginning. They fell in love. Yes, she fell in love with him right away. He was an attractive-looking boy. Nice way of talking and passing the time of day. You'd never think for one moment. There was a love affair, and it went wrong, and the girl committed suicide." "Suicide?"
The old woman stared at Miss Marple with startled eyes.
"Whoever told you that?"
"No. Murder it was. Bare-faced murder. Strangled at her head, beaten to pulp. Miss Clotilde had to go and identify her. She's never been quite the same since. They found the body a good 30 miles from here in the scrub of a disused quarry. It's believed that it wasn't the first murder he'd done. There'd been other girls. 6 months she'd been missing, and the police were searching far and wide. Oh, he's a wicked devil. A bad lot from the day he was born, so it seems." They say nowadays as there's those as can't help what they do, and they're not right in the head, and can't be held responsible. But I don't believe a word of that. Killers are killers, miss, and they don't even hang 'em nowadays. I know as there's often madness as runs in old families. There was the Derwents over at Brassington. Every second generation one or other of 'em died in the loony bin. And there was old Mrs. Paulet, walked about the lanes in her diamond tiara, saying she was Marie Antoinette, until they shut her up. But there wasn't anything really wrong with her, just a bit silly. But this boy, he was a devil. What did they do to him? Well, they'd abolished hanging by then, or else he was too young. I can't remember it all now. But they found him guilty, all right. It may have been Boston or Broadsand, one of those places beginning with B they sent him to. What was the name of the boy? Michael something, I don't remember. It's 10 years ago now that it happened. One forgets. It was an Italian sort of name, like one of them pictures. Raffle, that's it. Michael Raphael? That's it. There was a rumour as went about that his father, being so rich, got him wangled out of prison. But I think that was just talk. So, it had not been suicide. It had been murder. Love, Elizabeth Temple had named as the cause of a girl's death. In a way, she was right. A young girl had fallen in love with a killer, and for the love of him had gone unsuspecting to an ugly death. Miss Marple gave a little shudder. On her way along the village street yesterday, she'd passed a newspaper placard. Epsom Downs murder. Second girl's body discovered. Youth asked to assist police. So history repeated itself. An odd pattern, an ugly pattern. Some lines of forgotten verse came haltingly into her brain. Rose-white youth, passionate, pale, a singing stream in a silent vale, fairy prince in a prosy tale. Oh, there's nothing in life so finely frail as rose-white youth. Who was there to guard youth from pain and death? Youth who could not, who had never been able to, guard itself. Was it that they knew too little, or was it that they knew too much, and therefore thought they knew it all? Miss Marple, coming down the stairs that morning, probably rather earlier than she had been expected, found no immediate sign of her hostesses. She let herself out of the front door and wandered once more round the garden. It was not because she had really enjoyed this particular garden. It was more some vague feeling that there was something here that she ought to take notice of, something that would give her some idea, or that had given her some idea, only she had not been, well, frankly, not been bright enough to realize just what the bright idea had been. Something she thought she ought to take note of, something that had a bearing. She was not at the moment anxious to see any of the three sisters. She wanted to turn a few things over in her mind. The new facts that had come to her through Janet's early tea-chat. A side gate stood open, and she went through it to the village street and along a line of small shops, to where a steeple poked up announcing the site of a church and its churchyard. She pushed open the lich gate and wandered about among the graves, some dating from quite a while back, some by the far wall, later ones, and one or two beyond the wall in what was obviously a new enclosure. There was nothing of great interest among the older tombs. Certain names recurred, as they do in villages. A good many princes of village origin had been buried. Jasper Prince, deeply regretted, Marjorie Prince, Edgar and Walter Prince, Melanie Prince, 4 years old. A family record. Hiram Broad, Ellen Jean Broad, Eliza Broad, 91 years. She was turning away from the latter when she observed an elderly man moving in slow motion among the graves, tidying up as he walked. He gave her a salute and a good morning.
Good morning. It's a very pleasant day.
It'll turn to rain later.
There seem to be a lot of princes and Broads buried here.
Yes. There's always been princes here. Used to own quite a bit of land once. There have been Broads a good many years, too.
I see a child is buried here. It's very sad when one sees a child's grave.
Oh, yes, that's little Melanie, that is. Melly, we called her. Yes, it was a sad death. Run over she was. Ran out into the street to get some sweets at the sweet shop. Oh, it happens a lot nowadays. Cars go through at such a pace, they do.
It is sad to think that there are so many deaths all the time, and one doesn't really notice it until one looks at inscriptions in the churchyard. Sickness, old age, children run over, sometimes even more dreadful things. Young girls killed. Crimes, I mean.
Ah, yes, there's a lot of that about. Silly girls, I call most of them. And their mums haven't got time to look after them properly nowadays, what with going out to work so much.
Miss Marple rather agreed with his criticism, but had no wish to waste time in agreement on the trend of the day.
You're staying at the old manor house, aren't you? Come here on the coach tour, I saw. It got too much for you, I dare say. Some of those that are getting on can't always take it.
I did find it a little exhausting. A very kind friend of mine, Mr. Raphael, he wrote to some friends of his here. They invited me to stay for a couple of nights.
The name Raphael clearly meant nothing to the elderly gardener.
Mrs. Glynn and her 2 sisters have been very kind. I suppose they've lived here a long time.
Not so long as that. 20 years, maybe. It belonged to old Colonel Bradbury Scott, the old manor house. Close on 70 he was when he died.
Did he have any children?
A son killed in the war. That's why he left the place to his nieces. Nobody else to leave it to.
He went back to work among the graves. Miss Marple went into the church. It had felt the hand of a Victorian restorer, and had bright Victorian glass in the windows. 1 or 2 brasses and some tablets on the walls were all that was left of the past. Miss Marple sat down in an uncomfortable pew and wondered about things. Was she on the right track now? Things were connecting up, but the connections were far from clear. A girl had been murdered. Actually, several girls had been murdered. Suspected young men, or youths as they were usually called nowadays, had been rounded up by the police to assist in their inquiries. A common pattern, but this was all old history, dating back 10 or 12 years. There was nothing to find out now, no problems to solve. A tragedy, finished. What could be done by her? What could Mr. Raphael possibly want her to do?
Elizabeth Temple. I must get Elizabeth Temple to tell me more. She spoke of a girl who'd been engaged to be married to Michael Raphael. Now, was that really so? It does not seem to be known to those in the old manor house.
A more familiar version came into Miss Marple's mind, a kind of story that had been reasonably frequent in her own village, starting, as always, boy meets girl, developing in the usual way.
The girl finds she is pregnant. She tells the boy, and she wants him to marry her. But he perhaps does not want to marry her. He has never had any idea of marrying her. But things may be made difficult for him in this case, because his father possibly won't hear of such a thing, and her relations would insist that he did the right thing. But by now, maybe he is tired of the girl. Maybe he has another girl. So he takes a quick, brutal way out, and strangles her, beats her head to a pulp to avoid identification. It fits with his record, a brutal, sordid crime, but forgotten and done with.
She looked round the church in which she was sitting. It looked so peaceful. The reality of evil was hard to believe in. A flair for evil, that was what Mr. Raphael had attributed to her. She rose and walked out of the church and stood looking round the churchyard again. Here, among the gravestones and their worn inscriptions, no sense of evil moved in her. So was it evil she'd sensed yesterday at the old manor house? That deep depression of despair, that dark, desperate grief? Anthea Bradbury Scott, her eyes gazing fearfully back over one shoulder, as though fearing some presence that stood there, always stood there, behind her. They knew something, those 3 sisters. But what was it they knew? She pictured Elizabeth Temple with the rest of the coach party striding across the downs at this moment, climbing up a steep path and gazing over the cliffs out to sea. Tomorrow, when she rejoined the tour, she would get Elizabeth Temple to tell her more.
Miss Marple retraced her steps to the old manor house, walking rather slowly, because she was by now tired. She could not really feel that her morning had been productive in any way. So far the old manor house had given her no distinctive ideas of any kind. A tale of a past tragedy told by Janet, but there was always past tragedies treasured in the memories of domestic workers, and which were remembered quite as clearly as all the happy events, such as spectacular weddings, big entertainments, and successful operations, or accidents from which people had recovered, but in a miraculous manner. As she drew near the gate, she saw two female figures standing there. One of them detached itself and came to meet her. It was Mrs. Glynn.
"Oh, there you are. We wondered, you know. I thought you must have gone out for a walk somewhere. I did so hope that you wouldn't overtire yourself. If I'd known you'd come downstairs and gone out, I would have come with you to show you everything there is to show. Not that there is very much. Oh, I just wandered around. The churchyard, you know, and the church. I'm always very interested in churches. Sometimes there are very curious epitaphs. Things like that interest me. I make quite a collection of them. I suppose the church here was restored in Victorian times. Yes, they put in some rather ugly pews, I think. You know, good quality wood and strong and all that, but not very artistic. I hope they didn't take away anything of particular interest. No, I don't think so. It's not really that old for a church. There did not seem many tablets or brasses or anything of that kind. Are you interested in ecclesiastical architecture? Well, I don't make a study of it or anything like that, but of course in my own village, St. Marymead, things do rather revolve around the church. I mean, they always have. In my young days that was so. Nowadays, of course, it's rather different. Were you brought up in this neighbourhood? Oh, not really. We lived not very far away, but it was about 30 miles or so, at Little Hurdsley. My father was a retired serviceman, a major in the artillery. We came over here occasionally to see my uncle, indeed to see my great-uncle before him. But no, I've not even been here very much of late years. My other two sisters moved in after my uncle's death, but at that time I was still abroad with my husband. He only died about 4 or 5 years ago. Oh, I see. They were anxious I should come and join them. Really, it seemed the best thing to do. We'd lived in India for some years. My husband was still stationed there at the time of his death. It is very difficult nowadays to know where one would wish to, well, should I say, put one's roots down. Yes, indeed, I can quite see that. And you felt, of course, that you had roots here, since your family has been here for such a long time. Yes, one did feel that. Of course, I've always kept up with my sisters. I've been to visit them. But things are always very different from what one thinks they will be. I have bought a small cottage near London, near Hampton Court, where I spend a good deal of my time, and I do little occasional work for 1 or 2 charities in London. Oh, so your time is fully occupied. How wise of you. I have felt of late that I should spend more time here, perhaps. I've been a little worried about my sisters. Their health? One is rather worried nowadays, especially as there is not really anyone competent whom one can employ to look after people as they become rather feebler or have certain ailments. So much rheumatism and arthritis about. One is always so afraid of people falling down in the bath or an accident coming downstairs, something of that kind. Oh, Clotilde has always been very strong, tough, I should describe her. But I'm rather worried sometimes about Anthea. She's vague, you know, very vague indeed. She wanders off sometimes, doesn't seem to know where she is. Yes, it is sad when people worry. There is so much to worry one. I don't really think there is much to worry, Anthea. She worries about income tax, perhaps, money affairs. No, not that so much. But she does worry about the garden. She remembers it as it used to be, you see. She'd like to spend money to put things right again, but Clotilde's had to tell her that there really is no money that can be afforded for it nowadays. She keeps talking of the hothouses, the peaches that used to be there, the grapes and all that. And the cherry pie on the walls. Oh,
Oh, fancy her remembering that. Yes, yes, it was one of the things one does remember. Such a charming smell. Heliotrope. Such a nice name for it, cherry pie. One always remembers it. And the grapevine, the little small early sweet grapes. Oh, one must not remember the past too much. And the flower borders too, I suppose. Yes, yes, Anthea would like to have a big, well-kept, herbaceous border again. Really not feasible now. It's as much as one can do to get local people who'll come and mow the lawns every fortnight. Every year one seems to employ a different firm. And Anthea would like pampas grass planted again. And the Mrs. Simpkin pinks, white, you know, all along the stone-edge border. And a fig tree grew just outside the greenhouse. She remembers all these and talks about them. It must be difficult for you. Yes. Arguments, you see, hardly appeal in any way. Clotilde, of course, is very downright about things. She just refuses point blank, says she doesn't want to hear another word about it. It is difficult to know how to take things, whether one should be firm or rather authoritative, perhaps even, well, just a little fierce, you know, or whether one should be sympathetic, listen to things and perhaps hold out hopes which one knows are not justified. Yes, it's difficult. You see, I go away again and then come back now and then to stay, so it's easy for me to pretend things may be easier soon and that something may be done. But really, the other day when I came home and I found Anthea had tried to engage a most expensive firm of landscape gardeners to renovate the garden and to build up the greenhouse again, which is quite absurd, because even if you put vines in, they wouldn't bear for another 2 or 3 years. Clotilde knew nothing about it. She was extremely angry when she discovered the estimate for the work. Oh, she was really most unkind to Anthea. So many things are difficult. It was a useful phrase which she used often. I shall have to go rather early tomorrow morning, I think. I was making inquiries at the Golden Boar, where I understand the coach party assembles tomorrow morning, and they're making quite an early start. 9 o'clock, I understand. Oh, dear, I hope you'll not find it too fatiguing. Oh, I don't think so. I gather we're going to a place, what's it called? Stirling St. Mary, something like that. And it does not seem to be very far away. There's an interesting church to see on the way, and a castle. In the afternoon there's quite a pleasant garden, and not too many acres, but some special flowers, I understand. I feel sure that after the very nice rest I've had here, I shall be quite all right. I understand now that I would have been very tired if I had had these days of climbing up cliff sides and all the rest of it. Well, you must rest this afternoon, so to be fresh for tomorrow. Miss Marple has been to visit the church, Clotilde.
I'm afraid there's not very much to see there. Victorian glass of a most hideous kind. At least that's what I think. No expense spared. I'm afraid my uncle was partly to blame. He was very pleased with those rather crude red and blues.
Very crude, very vulgar, I always think.
Miss Marple settled down again after lunch to have a nap, and she did not join forces with her hostesses until nearly dinner-time. After dinner a good deal of chat went on until it was bedtime. Miss Marple set the tone in remembrances of her own youth, her early days, places she had visited, travels or tours she had made, occasional people she had known. She went to bed tired, with a sense of failure. She had learned nothing more, possibly because there was nothing more to learn. A fishing expedition where the fish did not rise, possibly because there were no fish there. Or it could be that she did not know the right bait to use. Miss Marple's tea was brought in at 7:30 the following morning, so as to allow her plenty of time to get up and pack her few belongings. She was just closing her small suitcase when there was a rather hurried tap on the door, and Clotilde came in, looking upset.
Oh, dear, Miss Marple, there's a young man downstairs who's called to see you. Emlyn Price. He's on the door with you, and they sent him here.
Oh, of course, I remember him. Yes, quite young?
Oh, yes, very modern-looking, a lot of hair and all that. But he's really come to... Well, he's come to break some bad news to you.
I'm afraid there's been an accident.
An accident? You mean to the coach? Someone has been hurt?
No, it was not the coach. There's been no trouble there. It was in the course of the expedition yesterday afternoon. There was a great deal of wind, you may remember. Oh, I don't think that can have anything to do with it. People strayed about a bit, I think. There is a regular path, but you can also climb up and go across the downs. Both ways lead to the memorial tower on the top of the Bonaventure. That's where they were all making for. People got separated a bit, I suppose, really. There's no one actually guiding them or looking after them, which perhaps there ought to have been. People are not so very sure-footed always, and the slope overhanging the gorge is very steep. Well, there was a bad fall of stones or rocks that came crashing down the hillside and knocked someone out on the path below.
Oh, dear, I am sorry. Oh, I'm most terribly sorry. Who was it who was hurt?
Miss Temple, or Tenderton, or something, I understand.
Elizabeth Temple? Oh, dear, I am sorry. I talked to her a good deal. I sat in the next seat to her on the coach. She is a retired schoolmistress, I believe. Very well-known one.
Of course. Yes, I know her quite well. She was headmistress of Fallowfield. It's quite a famous school. I'd no idea she was on this tour. She's retired as headmistress, I think, a year or two ago. There's a new, rather young headmistress there now, with rather advanced, progressive ideas. But Miss Temple's not very old, really. She's only about 60, I should think. Very active. Fond of climbing and walking and all the rest of it. This really seems most unfortunate. I do hope she's not badly hurt. I haven't heard the details yet.
This is quite ready now, said Miss Marple, snapping down the lid of her suitcase. I will come at once and see Mr. Price.
Clotilde seized the suitcase. Oh, let me. I can carry it perfectly. Come down with me. Be careful of the stairs. Miss Marple came down. Emmeline Price was waiting for her. His hair was looking even wilder than usual, and he was wearing a splendid array of fancy boots and a leather jerkin and brilliant emerald green trousers. Such an unfortunate business, he said, seizing Miss Marple's hand. I thought I'd come along myself and, well, break it to you about the accident. I expect Miss Bradbury Scott has told you. It's Miss Temple, you know, the school dame. I don't know quite what she was doing or what happened, but some stones or boulders, really, they rolled down from above. It's rather a precipitous slope. It knocked her out. They had to take her to hospital with concussion last night. I gather she's rather bad. Anyway, the tour for today is cancelled. We're stopping on here tonight.
Oh, dear, I'm so very sorry.
I think they've decided not to go on today because, well, they've got to wait and see what the medical report is, I suppose. So we're proposing to spend one more night here at the Golden Boar and rearrange the tour a little, which we were doing tomorrow. It's not very interesting, really. At least that's what they say. Mrs. Sanborn's gone off to the hospital to see how things are this morning. She's going to join us at the Golden Boar for coffee at 11 o'clock. I thought perhaps you'd like to come along and hear the latest news.
Yes, I'll certainly come along with you. At once.
She turned to say good-bye to Clotilde and Mrs. Glynn, who had joined her.
I must thank you so much. You've been so kind. It's been so delightful to have these 2 nights here. I feel so rested. Most unfortunate that this has now occurred. If you'd like to spend another night, I'm sure.
It occurred to Miss Marple, who had as sharp a sideways glance as anyone could desire, that Clotilde had a slightly disapproving look at this suggestion. She almost shook her head, though it was such a small movement it hardly noticed. But she was, Miss Marple thought, hushing down the suggestion that Mrs. Glynn was making.
Although, of course, I expect it would be nicer for you to be with the others, and to— Oh, yes, I think it would be better. I shall know then what the plans are, and what to do about things. Perhaps I can even be of help in some way. One never knows. So thank you again very much. It'll not be difficult, I expect, to get a room at the Golden Boar.
Oh, no, it'll be all right. Several rooms have been vacated today. They won't be full at all. Mrs. Sanborn, I think, has booked for all the party to stay there tonight anyway. And tomorrow, well, we're just going to have to see how it all goes on. Goodbyes were said again, and thanks. Emmeline Price took Miss Marple's belongings and started out at a good striding pace. It's really only just round the corner and then the first street to the left.
Yes, I passed it yesterday.
Poor Miss Temple. I do hope she's not badly hurt.
I think she is, rather. Of course, you know what doctors are and hospital people. They always say the same thing, as well as can be expected. There's no local hospital. They had to take her to Carristown, which is at least 8 miles away. Anyway, Mrs. Sanborn will be back with the news by the time we fixed you up at the hotel. They got there to find the tour assembled in the coffee room, and coffee and morning buns and pastries being served. Mr. and Mrs. Butler were talking at the moment.
Oh, it's just too tragic, this happening. Just too upsetting, isn't it? Just when we were all so happy and enjoying everything so much. Poor Miss Temple. I always thought she was very sure-footed, but then, you know, you never can tell. Can you, Henry?
No, indeed. I'm wondering, really, our time's very short, whether we hadn't better, give up the tour at this point here and not continue. I mean, it seems there's bound to be a bit of difficulty resuming things until we know definitely. If this is serious, it could prove fatal. There might have to be an inquest or something of that kind.
Oh, Henry, don't say dreadful things like that.
I'm sure, said Miss Cook, that you're being a little too pessimistic, Mr. Butler. I'm sure things couldn't be as serious as that.
In his foreign voice, Mr. Casper said,
But yes, they are serious. I hear yesterday, when Mrs. Sanborn talked on telephone to doctor, it is very, very serious. They say she has concussion. Bad. Very bad. A special doctor, he is coming to look at her and see if he can operate or if it is impossible. It is all very bad.
Oh, dear, said Miss Lumley. If there's any doubt, perhaps we ought to go home, Mildred. I must look up the trains, I think. You see, Mrs. Butler, I've made arrangements about my cats with the neighbours, and if I was delayed a day or two, it might make great difficulties for everyone.
Well, it's no good our working ourselves up too much, said Mrs. Risley Porter in her deep, authoritative voice. Joanna, put this bun in the waste-paper basket, will you? It's really quite uneatable. Most unpleasant jam. But I don't want to leave it on my plate. It might make bad feeling.
Joanna got rid of a bun and said,
Do you think it'll be all right if Emily and I went for a walk?
I mean, just sort of round the town. It's not much good our sitting here making gloomy remarks, is it? We can't do anything. I think you'd be very wise to go out, said Miss Cook.
Yes, you go along, said Miss Barrow, before Mrs. Risley Porter could speak. Miss Cook and Miss Barrow looked at each other and sighed, shaking their heads. Tea, coffee, biscuits and cakes dispatched. Everyone seemed somewhat dissociated and ill at ease. When a catastrophe has occurred, it is very difficult to know what is the proper way to meet it. Everyone has given their view, has expressed surprise and distress, and are now awaiting news, and at the same time has a slight hankering after some form of sightseeing, some interest to carry them through the morning. Lunch would not be served until 1 o'clock, and they felt really that to sit around and repeat the same remarks would be rather a gloomy business. Miss Cook and Miss Barrow rose as one woman and explained that it was necessary for them to do a little shopping. 1 or 2 things they needed, and they also wished to go to the post office and buy stamps. I want to send off 1 or 2 postcards, and I want to inquire about postal dues on a letter to China, said Miss Barrow. And I want to match some wools, and also it seemed to me there was rather an interesting building on the other side of the market square, said Miss Cook. I think it would do us all good to get out, said Miss Barrow. Colonel and Mrs. Walker rose too, and suggested to Mr. and Mrs. Butler that they might go out and see what there was to see. Mrs. Butler expressed hopes of an antique shop.
Only I don't really mean a real antique shop, more what you'd call a junk shop. Sometimes you can pick up some really interesting things there. Isn't that right, Henry?
Yes, that's right. That's absolutely right.
They all trooped out. Emmeline Price had already sidled to the door and disappeared in pursuit of Joanna, without troubling to use conversation to explain his departure. Mrs. Risley Porter, having made a belated attempt to call her niece back, said she thought that at least the lounge would be a rather more pleasant place to sit in. Miss Lumley agreed. Mr. Casper escorted the ladies with the air of a foreign equerry. Professor Wanstead and Miss Marple remained.
I think myself that it would be pleasant to sit outside the hotel. There is a small terrace giving on the street.
if I might persuade you.
Oh, thank you. Yes, that would be most pleasant.
She'd hardly exchanged a word with the professor so far. He'd several learned-looking books with him, one of which he was usually perusing. Even in the coach he continued to try and read. Oh, perhaps you want to shop. I myself would prefer to wait somewhere peacefully for the return of Mrs. Sandbourne. It's important, I think, that we should know exactly what we are in for.
I quite agree with you as to that. I did a certain amount of walking round the town yesterday. I don't feel any necessity to do so again today. I'd rather wait here in case there is anything I can do to help. Not that I suppose there is, but one never knows.
They moved together through the hotel door and round the corner to where there was a little square of garden with a raised stone walk close to the wall of the hotel, and on which there were various forms of basket chairs. There was no one there at the moment, so they sat down. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at her vis-à-vis, at his corrugated and wrinkled face, his bushy brows, his luxuriant head of grey hair. He walked with a slight stoop. He had an interesting face, Miss Marple decided. His voice was dry and caustic. A professional man of some kind, she thought. I'm not wrong, am I? You are Miss Jane Marple.
Yes, I am Jane Marple.
She was slightly surprised. They'd not been together long enough for people to identify each other, and the last 2 nights she'd not been with the rest of the party. I thought so, from the description I've had of you.
A description of me?
Yes, I had a description of you. From Mr. Raphael.
Oh, from Mr. Raphael?
You're surprised?
Well, yes, I am, rather.
I don't know that you should be.
Well, I didn't expect.
Professor Wanstead did not speak. He was merely sitting, looking at her intently. In a minute or two, thought Miss Marple to herself, he will say to me, "What symptoms exactly, dear lady? Any discomfort in swallowing? Any lack of sleep? Digestion in good order?" She was almost sure now. He was a doctor.
When did he describe me to you? That must have been...
You're going to say some time ago, some weeks ago, before his death, that is so. He told me you would take this tour.
And he knew that you would be going on it too?
Yes, you could put it that way. He said you'd be travelling on this tour, and that he'd arranged for you to be travelling on it.
Yes, it was very kind of him, very kind indeed. I was most surprised when I found he'd booked me. It was such a treat. I would never have been able to afford it for myself.
Yes. Well put. He nodded his head, as one who applauds a good performance by a pupil.
It is sad that it has been interrupted in this fashion. Very sad indeed, when I'm sure we were all enjoying ourselves so much.
Yes, it's very sad. And unexpected, do you think? Or not unexpected?
What do you mean by that, Professor Wanstead?
Mr. Raphael spoke to me about you at some length, Miss Marple. He suggested that I should be on this tour with you. I should in due course almost certainly make your acquaintance, since members in a tour inevitably do make each other's acquaintance, though it usually takes a day or two for them to split up, as it were, into possible groupings led by similar tastes or interests. He further suggested that I should, shall we say, keep an eye on you.
Keep an eye on me? And for what reason?
I think reasons of protection. He wanted to be quite sure that nothing should happen to you.
Happen to me? Well, what should happen to me, I should like to know?
Possibly what happened to Miss Elizabeth Temple. Joanna Crawford came round the corner of the hotel. She was carrying a shopping basket. She passed them, nodding a little, and looked towards them with slight curiosity as she went down the street. Professor Wanstead did not speak till she'd gone out of sight. A nice girl. At least I think so. Content at present to be a beast of burden to an autocratic aunt, but I have no doubt she will reach the age of rebellion fairly soon.
What did you mean by what you just said now?
That is a question which, perhaps, owing to what has happened, we shall have to discuss.
You mean because of the accident?
Yes. If it was an accident.
You think it was not an accident?
I think it is possible that it was not, that is all.
I don't, of course, know anything about it.
No, you were absent from the scene. You were, shall I put it, you were possibly on duty elsewhere.
Miss Marple was silent for a moment. She looked at Professor Wanstead once or twice, then said, "I don't think I know exactly what you mean."
"You're being very careful, and you are quite right to be careful."
"I have made a habit of it."
"To be careful?"
"I should not put it exactly like that, but I have always made a point of being ready to disbelieve as well as believe anything that is told to me."
"Yes, and you are quite right too. You don't know anything about me. You know my name from a passenger list of a very agreeable tour, visiting castles and historic houses and splendid gardens. And possibly the gardens are what will interest you most."
"Possibly."
"There are other people here who are interested in gardens."
"Or profess to be interested in gardens."
"Ah, you've noticed that. Well, it was my part, or at any rate to begin with, to observe you and watch what you're doing, to be near at hand in case there was any possibility, well, we might call it roughly dirty work of any kind. But things are slightly altered now. You must make up your mind if I am your enemy or your ally."
"Perhaps you're right. You put it very clearly. But you've not given me any information about yourself on which to judge. You were a friend, I presume, of the late Mr. Raphael?"
"No, I was not a friend of Mr. Raphael. I met him once or twice, once on a committee of a hospital, once at some other public event. I knew about him, and I gather he also knew about me. If I say to you, Miss Marple, that I am a man of some eminence in my own profession, you may think me a man of bounding conceit."
"I do not think so. I should say, if you say that about yourself, that you are probably speaking the truth. You are perhaps a medical man."
"You are perceptive, Miss Marple. Yes, you are quite perceptive. I have a medical degree, but I have a speciality too. I am a pathologist and a psychologist. I don't carry credentials with me, so you will probably have to take my word up to a certain point. But I can show you letters addressed to me, possibly official documents that might convince you. I undertake mainly specialist work in connection with medical jurisprudence. To put it in perfectly plain everyday language, I am interested in the different types of criminal brain. That has been a study of mine for many years. I have written books on the subject, and some of them violently disputed, others which have attracted adherents to my ideas. I do not do very arduous work nowadays. I spend my time mainly writing up my subject, stressing certain points that have appealed to me. From time to time I come across things that strike me as interesting, things that I want to study more closely. This, I'm afraid, must seem rather tedious to you."
"Not at all. I'm hoping, perhaps, from what you are saying now, that you will be able to explain to me certain things which Mr. Raphael did not see fit to explain to me. He asked me to embark upon a certain project, but he gave me no useful information on which to work. He left me to accept it and to proceed, as it were, completely in the dark. It seemed to me extremely foolish of him to treat the matter in that way."
"But you accepted it?"
"I accepted it, and I will be quite honest with you. I had a financial incentive."
"Did that weigh with you?"
"You may not believe it, but my answer to that is not really."
"No, I'm not surprised. But your interest was aroused. That is what you're trying to tell me."
"Yes, my interest was aroused. I had known Mr. Raphael, not well, but casually, for a certain period of time, some weeks, in fact, in the West Indies. Oh, I see you know about it, more or less."
"I know that was where Mr. Raphael met you, and where shall I say, you two collaborated."
"Oh, he said that, did he?"
"Yes, he did. He said you had a remarkable flair for criminal matters." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows as she looked at him.
And I suppose that seems to you most unlikely. It surprises you.
I seldom allow myself to be surprised at what happens. Mr. Raphael was a very shrewd and astute man, a good judge of people. He thought that you, too, were a good judge of people.
I would not set myself up as a good judge of people. I would only say that certain people remind me of certain other people that I have known, and that therefore I can presuppose a certain likeness between them and the way they act. If you think I know all about what I am supposed to be doing here, you are wrong.
By accident more than design, we seem to have settled here in a particularly suitable spot for discussion of certain matters. We do not appear to be overlooked, and we cannot easily be overheard. We are not near a window or a door, and there is no balcony or window overhead. In fact, we can talk.
I should appreciate it. I am stressing the fact that I am myself completely in the dark as to what I am doing or supposed to be doing. I do not know why Mr. Raphael wanted it that way.
Well, I think I can guess that. He wanted you to approach a certain set of facts, of happenings, unbiased by what anyone would tell you first.
So you are not going to tell me anything either? Really, there are limits.
Yes, I agree with you. We must do away with some of those limits. I am going to tell you certain facts that will make certain things fairly clear to you. You, in turn, may be able to tell me certain facts.
I rather doubt it. One or two rather peculiar indications, perhaps, but indications are not facts.
Therefore, Professor Wanstead paused.
For goodness sake, tell me something.